What do you hope to change and reflect upon on this day?
So first of all, Caroline, thank you so much for having me today. This is really a special day for Female Founders Fund. We're now actually in year 10, and just seeing the culmination of years of doing these gatherings to bring these female founders together and to really provide them with a day of inspiration as well as a day of community, because we all know that the job of an entrepreneur is incredibly lonely, and really feeling like there are others in the room who are going through similar challenges, I think has been an incredibly valuable part of the work that we do.
The DEI pendulum has shifted in many ways, and ultimately the still hand-wringing continues when you look at the statistics of how little money is allocated towards minority founders, and indeed how few VCs are in the room that look like you. I'm interested as to whether you not think entrepreneurship is still as lonely as it was. Are things getting any more positive in this current economic landscape?
So I guess I'll start out by saying that it's still incredibly challenging to be an entrepreneur in general. I think what has changed and shifted is that you have more role models of success. So you have more examples of women in particular, in our case, who have actually built that billion-dollar business, who've taken a company public, who have had significant exits. And so I think that 10 years ago, we just didn't have that. And I think that that is something that, just again reflects that while things are moving slowly, just the recognition that we now have role models to look up to, I think is a win.
And I know you've backed some of those winners, and 10 years ago it was all about e-commerce, it was about the consumer, it was about, well, the new world of app technology. Where is it now? Where are you excited to be allocating checks?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting time in venture investing right now. I think the investable categories have shifted significantly. For us at Female Founders Fund, we remain really excited about digital health. Maven was one of our early investments. We just announced the Series B funding for ULA this week, which is incredibly exciting. Beauty and personal care is another category that we think remains resilient. You've seen some incredible exits and outcomes over the past 12 months. Vertical software solutions, that remains consistent theme across the last decade. And then lastly, I would say the newer category where we've been actively investing is climate tech.
Let's go in on climate tech, because some might say that gets a whole load of politicization around it, particularly as we enter an election year. How are you seeing real-world use cases of the technology that you're starting to back?
Yeah, it's a fairly broad category. I'll give you a couple of examples. So we invested in a company last year called Watts, which is a waste management software solution, helping large hospitality players do a better job of managing the expense around their waste. We've also invested in the first hydrogen-powered private plane company started by a French aeronautics engineer. So I think there's a lot of opportunity, but I think at the end of the day, what we're really looking for is, where are the exits? Are these categories or businesses that have a large acquirer base? And I think within climate tech, there's so much interest and so much need for better products and solutions.
I'm sure a lot of your LPs often are asking, where are the exits? And you think a lot about ultimately where we are in a landscape right now. IPO market, still not looking that pretty. Have you seen an uptick in M&A? Have you seen interest and inbound coming towards you after some of your portfolio companies?
I think the last 12 to 18 months have been incredibly challenging, both in terms of raising growth capital as well as obviously IPO markets being closed, and M&A for that matter. I actually don't. I think if you look to the remainder of this year, it's going to be challenging. You have an election year coming up, and it's funny. There's a motto in VC right now: survive till 25. I think it's going to be a tough year this year, but I think if you're able to come through, that's the advice that we're giving our founders.
And isn't it amazing that you've called it the year of women, and we have just tail end of 2024. We think of the achievements of, ultimately how much economic impact Beyonce and Taylor Swift put together have had on the US economy. You are not only a VC, but ultimately you're a founder yourself, having set up the Female Founders Fund. How are you seeing your role change and what's being asked of you in this particular moment from your own portfolio companies and society at large?
Yeah, no, I think the shift has really been, looking at our portfolio companies and the advice and the way that we kind of work with them. There's definitely been, a shift, I would say, in terms of how do we get from, a more growth at all costs strategy to just running our businesses efficiently. And so that requires a lot of work on the budget. It requires really thinking through team structure and really honing in on what it is that that your business needs to survive. And that, I think, for founders as well as VCs is a skill set that we haven't necessarily had to leverage or use for over a decade.